When Elena Moreau signed her name in ink, she didn't know she was signing it in blood. Some women are sold for love, some for security. Elena Moreau was sold for a dead man's debt, her father's gambling empire reduced to a single number on a contract she signed at 3 in the morning with shaking hands and a lawyer who wouldn't meet her eyes. The man who purchased her obligation wasn't a businessman or a banker. He was Damien Vescari, Philadelphia's most feared name, the kind of man whose silence in a room made grown men forget how to breathe. And now, sitting in the back of a black SUV rolling toward his estate, through streets that seemed to empty themselves at his approach, Elena was about to discover that everything she'd been told about him, every whispered warning, every horrified rumor, every terrified story, was only half the truth. If this story already has your pulse running, stay until the very end, because what happens inside those iron gates will break every assumption you walked in with. Hit that like button now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Elena Moreau buried her father, she spent exactly 40 minutes crying. That was all she permitted herself. 40 minutes on the cold tile floor of the funeral home bathroom, back pressed against the cabinet beneath the sink, knees pulled to her chest, while the fluorescent light above her buzzed and flickered like it couldn't decide whether to commit. She counted her own breaths the way her father had taught her to count cards, methodically, without mercy, because sentiment was a luxury that cost more than it ever paid back. She was 26 years old. She had $1,100 in a checking account, a studio apartment she'd already been given notice to vacate, and a name that meant nothing in a city where names were the only currency that mattered. Her father, Bernard Moreau, had been a charming man. She knew that. She'd loved him the way you love a beautiful piece of furniture that keeps breaking, with diminishing hope and stubborn attachment. He'd also been a catastrophic gambler, and a man who believed with genuine conviction that his luck was always one more hand away from turning. It never turned. What it did instead was accumulate, compound, and eventually collapse into a number so large it had ceased to feel real. $2,400,000. Owed to a man whose financial operations were technically legitimate enough to survive regulatory scrutiny and functionally criminal enough that no district attorney in Pennsylvania had yet found the courage to pursue them seriously. Damien Vescari had not come to the funeral. He'd sent a lawyer instead, a thin man named Hargrove in an expensive suit that somehow still looked cheap, who waited until the last mourner had filed out before approaching Elena with a manila envelope and the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had become reflexive rather than felt. The envelope contained a contract. The contract contained language that was, technically, a choice. Elena could sign and agree to a marriage arrangement, a term the document used with stunning clinical detachment, in exchange for complete cancellation of her father's debt and a guarantee of financial stability for the duration of the agreement. Or she could decline, in which case the debt would be pursued through all available legal channels, which Hargrove explained with quiet precision meant that every asset her father had ever touched, including the small insurance policy he'd maintained in her name, would be subject to collection proceedings. She'd asked for 24 hours. Hargrove had given her 12. Elena had spent those 12 hours walking. She walked from the funeral home to the waterfront and back. She walked until her feet ached, and her mind had exhausted every argument it could construct against the only decision that had any logic to it. She walked, and she thought about her mother, who had died when Elena was 9, and had never known the particular kind of loneliness that comes from loving someone whose primary relationship is with their own destruction. She thought about the $1,100. She thought about the word marriage and how it had never, in any version of her life she'd imagined, appeared in a sentence with the word arrangement. Then she went back to the funeral home, found Hargrove still waiting in the parking lot, and signed the contract on the hood of his car. She'd asked only one question. What is he like? Hargrove had hesitated for precisely long enough to answer without answering. He's a man who keeps his word, he'd said finally. Elena had decided that would have to be enough. The Vescari estate sat 12 miles outside Philadelphia proper, behind a wrought iron gate flanked by stone columns that had been old before her parents were born. The SUV that collected her, black, bulletproof, smelling of leather, and something faintly chemical she couldn't identify, arrived at her apartment at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. The driver didn't speak. The second man in the passenger seat didn't turn around. Elena sat in the back with a single suitcase and watched the city she'd lived in her entire life recede through the tinted window like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The gate opened before they reached it. Someone had been watching. The driveway was longer than her entire block. The house at the end of it was the kind of structure that had been built by someone with both the money to make a statement and the intelligence to ensure the statement was restrained. 3 stories of pale stone, dark windows, and a front entrance flanked by columns that matched the gate. Every light in the house was on. The grounds were immaculate. A man stood at the top of the front steps in a dark suit, hands clasped behind his back, watching the vehicle approach with the particular stillness of someone who has spent years making stillness into a weapon. This was not Damien Vescari. Elena knew that immediately. This man was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something better. Seasoned, patient, unreadable. He came down the steps as the driver opened her door. "Victor Bellini," he said, without extending a hand. "I manage Mr. Vescari's affairs. He'll see you in the study. Follow me." No welcome, no pleasantries, no attempt to make the situation feel like anything other than what it was. Elena found herself oddly grateful for that. The inside of the house was quieter than she'd expected. She'd spent the drive telling herself not to expect anything, not warmth, not hostility, not normalcy of any recognizable kind. But she'd expected noise, the presence of people, guards, the ambient sound of an organization that extended across 3 states and employed hundreds of men. Instead, she heard her own footsteps on marble flooring, the distant tick of a clock, and the soft sound of rain beginning against the tall windows to her left. Victor walked without hurrying. She followed. The hallway they moved through was lined with paintings she recognized as valuable without being able to name. Dark, serious work, the kind that depicted power rather than beauty. They turned twice before reaching a pair of double doors. Victor knocked once, opened them without waiting for a response, and stepped aside to let her pass. The study was large and dark except for the desk lamp and the fire. Books on every wall, real ones. Not decorative arrangements, but the dense, mismatched accumulation of someone who actually read. A chess set mid-game on a table by the window. A glass of whiskey on the corner of the desk, barely touched. And behind the desk, in a wheelchair positioned with its back 3/4 to the door, a man looking out at the rain through the window to his right. He didn't turn immediately. Elena stood in the doorway. Victor had already pulled the doors closed behind her. And for a moment she simply looked. She could see the line of his jaw, strong and sharp. Dark hair, cut short. A suit that cost more than her monthly rent had ever been. His right hand rested on the arm of the wheelchair, and she noticed it before she noticed anything else about him. The sleeve of his jacket was pushed up slightly at the wrist, and beneath it she could see something. A bandage, or the edge of one, wrapped tight. He hadn't been using the study for comfort. The glass on the desk was positioned precisely equidistant from both edges. The papers to his left were stacked with mathematical precision. This was a man in total control of every square inch of his environment, and the control wasn't comfort, it was compensation. "Close the door," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and carried no particular inflection, an instruction delivered to the room rather than to her specifically. "It is closed," she said. He turned then, not quickly. The motion of someone who has decided to turn, who is accustomed to making even small movements deliberate. Damien Vescari was 38 years old. She would learn that later, though she could have estimated it closely enough from his face. Not young, but not hardened in the way she'd imagined. The imagination tends toward extremes when it has nothing specific to work with, and Elena had constructed a version of him from rumor and fear that was more myth than man. The reality was someone more contained than that, more precise. His eyes were very dark, and they moved over her face with an attention that wasn't predatory exactly, but was absolute. The way a person reads a document that matters, missing nothing, committing it to memory. "Elena Moreau," he said. "Yes." "Sit down." She sat in the chair across the desk. She kept her spine straight and her hands loose in her lap, and she looked at him directly because looking away would have been the beginning of something she didn't intend to start. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The fire snapped. The rain accelerated against the glass. Then, "Did you read the contract in full?" Yes. Then you know what this is and what it isn't. I know what it says. Something shifted in his expression. A fractional change, like the adjustment of a lens. What does it say? He repeated. It says I'm your wife. It says the debt is canceled. It says I live here. She paused. It doesn't say very much about anything else. That's correct. He picked up the whiskey glass and held it without drinking from it. The things it doesn't specify, I'll specify now. You have the West Wing. It's yours. No one enters it without your permission, including me. You eat wherever you prefer. The kitchen, the dining room, your rooms. You have access to the library, the gardens, the east sitting room. You don't attend functions unless I ask you to, and when I ask, I don't require. The staff has instructions. The security arrangements are for your safety as much as mine, and they are not negotiable. And in exchange, Elena said, in exchange, you don't lie to me. He set the glass down. That is the single condition I will enforce. She looked at him. That's it? That's considerable, he said. People lie constantly. It's almost the default mode of human communication. If you tell me you're fine, be fine. If you're not, say so. If you disagree with something I've done or decided, say that. If something is wrong in this house, tell me directly. He paused. I don't require pretense. I don't want performance. I want the actual truth, whatever that costs. Elena was quiet for a moment. And if I find I can't do that, can't stay here, then you tell me that directly as well, and we find another arrangement. She watched him. He hadn't moved from his position. No shifts, no fidgeting, no tells that she could read clearly. The wheelchair was something she was consciously not making into the center of her attention because she understood already that it was something he had made peripheral in his own mind, or tried to. The bandage at his wrist was something different, something less controlled. She almost asked about it. She didn't. Can I ask you something? She said instead. You're going to anyway. Why the marriage? You could have bought the debt outright. You could have attached conditions that didn't require this. He looked at her for a moment. Because your father, before he became a liability, was a man I once had reason to respect. And because the contract structure provides you with legal protections you wouldn't otherwise have. She hadn't expected that. The honesty of it landed differently than anything she'd anticipated. Most men in the position he occupied didn't explain themselves. The explanation wasn't weakness. It was something more unsettling. It was consideration. She looked at her hands, then she looked back at him. All right, she said. All right. Victor will show you to your rooms. He turned back to the window. The conversation, apparently, was over. The West Wing was extraordinary in a way that felt deliberately understated. The bedroom was large and high-ceilinged with a four-poster bed that had clearly been made with someone's specific preferences in mind. The linens were soft without being fussy, the colors neutral and calm. A writing desk beneath the window. Shelves that were empty and waiting. A bathroom with a deep tub and lighting that actually functioned like light rather than performance. A sitting room attached, with a sofa and a reading chair and a lamp positioned at the correct angle for actual reading rather than aesthetic effect. Someone had thought about this. That was the detail that bothered Elena most as she stood in the center of the bedroom with her single suitcase and the sound of Victor's retreating footsteps receding down the hall. Someone had considered what a person might actually need in this space. Not what would impress them, not what would signal wealth, what would make a person feel, quietly, that their comfort had been taken into account. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was excellent. She thought, I'm in the house of a man who runs a criminal organization, and the thing that disturbs me most is how good the mattress is. Then she opened her suitcase and began to unpack, because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still had never been something Elena Moreau did well. The first week was almost entirely absence. She moved through the spaces she'd been given and the spaces she'd been told she had access to, and she encountered Damien Viscari infrequently and briefly. Breakfast was the most consistent overlap. He came to the kitchen early, before 7, and she'd already established a habit of coffee at 6:30 that she was disinclined to change. They occupied the kitchen at the same time without much conversation. He read something, documents, never a newspaper or a phone, while she drank her coffee and looked out the window at the gardens, which were extraordinary in the flat gray morning light. On the third morning, she asked, Do you always read that early? He looked up briefly. Yes. She went back to looking at the gardens. On the fifth morning, he said, "The roses in the far section are fall-blooming varieties. Most of the garden shuts down in October. Those persist until the first hard frost." She looked at the section he meant. She hadn't distinguished them from the others. They were darker than she'd expected. Deep red, almost burgundy, open wide in the cool morning air. "How do you know which is the far section?" she said. "You can't see them from where you're sitting." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the layout of the garden, the way I know the layout of the house." "Precisely." She looked at him. He was already looking back at his document. That's the second time she felt the thing she was trying not to feel. Not attraction, not exactly, not yet. Something more destabilizing than that. The sense of a person being more complex than the story about them, and the complexity being genuinely interesting rather than merely complicated. On the ninth day, she heard him in the east corridor at 11 at night. She'd been unable to sleep. She was still adjusting to the particular silence of a house this large, which was not actual silence, but a different acoustic register than anything she'd lived in before. She'd gotten up for water and was in the small kitchen adjacent to the west wing when the sound came. Irregular footsteps, a pause, the distinctive creak of a particular floorboard she'd already memorized, then nothing. Then a sound that was not quite a gasp, but was adjacent to one. She stood still. The sound didn't repeat. She went back to her room, drank the water, and spent the next hour lying in the dark analyzing what she'd heard and what it meant and what it was absolutely not her business to address. In the morning, she went to Victor. "Is there a physiotherapist?" she asked. "For Mr. Vescari." "He comes twice a week," Victor said with the careful expression of someone deciding how much to answer. "Tuesdays and Fridays. Does he do sessions on his own otherwise?" Victor looked at her for a long moment. "Ms. Moreau." "That wasn't a question that required that tone," she said. "I heard him last night in the corridor. He sounded like he was in pain. I'm not asking for details about his medical history. I'm asking if there's anything in place." Victor was quiet for a moment. "He has resistance equipment in the east room. He uses it independently, at night. He does not want anyone to witness that." She nodded. "Thank you." She did not go to the east room. She returned to the library and found a book on spinal injury rehabilitation that happened to be on the shelf there. She suspected not accidentally, and read for 3 hours. The first real confrontation happened on the 11th day, and it started over nothing, the way the meaningful ones always do. She had moved a vase from the hall table outside the library. It had been poorly positioned, blocking the natural sightline from the doorway, creating a visual interruption in a space that was otherwise clean and simple. She'd relocated it to the windowsill at the end of the hall, where it was better displayed and also, practically, out of the way of wheelchair navigation. She did this without thinking much about it. It was a visual instinct, the kind she acted on automatically in any space she occupied long enough. She'd been rearranging small things since she arrived, books reshelved by subject rather than size, a lamp moved 6 inches, a throw blanket folded properly rather than draped. She learned about the vase when Damien appeared in the library doorway at 4 in the afternoon, earlier than she'd seen him in that part of the house. "You moved it," he said. She looked up from her book. "The vase?" "Yes. It was blocking the doorway sightline, and it was a navigation hazard. It has been in that position for 6 years. That doesn't make it the right position. The pause that followed was the kind that has weight." He looked at her steadily. "This is my house. I'm aware of that." "Then don't rearrange it." She closed her book. "I moved a single vase 16 inches. I wasn't redecorating. The position it was in was impractical. It was also," he said, "very precisely where I know it to be." The sentence landed differently than she'd anticipated. She looked at him, and she understood it then. Not just the vase, but the precision with which he navigated every space, the exact angle at which he knew the kitchen table sat relative to the counter, the distance he maintained from furniture in the library. He'd mapped everything. He moved through this house with the knowledge of a person who has learned never to trust that objects will be where he left them. She put the vase back that afternoon. She said nothing about it to him, but she spent the next several days paying attention in a different way, watching how he moved, what he tracked, what he'd placed where and why. The architecture of a man building a world he could navigate with certainty because so many other certainties had been taken from him. She did not move anything else. She saw the bandage properly on the 14th day. She was in the garden, the section he'd mentioned with the fall roses, and he was there as well. She hadn't expected that, hadn't known he spent time in the garden. He was at the far end, partially obscured by the trellis, reading something he'd set on his knee. The afternoon light was low and autumn thin, and the roses behind him were exactly as dark and saturated as they'd appeared from the kitchen window. He hadn't seen her. She almost retreated. Instead, she stayed where she was and watched him, not out of rudeness, but out of the involuntary suspension that comes when you see a person being something other than what they present. He sat with his jacket removed, sleeves rolled to the elbow in the faint warmth of the 3 o'clock sun, and the bandage that wrapped his left forearm from below the elbow to the wrist was clearly visible. Clean, tight, recent. Not an old injury, not something rehabilitative or incidental. The type of wound that was being managed. He saw her then, and the shift in his expression was immediate. Not anger, not quite, but a rapid recalibration. He reached for his jacket. "I'm not going to say anything," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I was here first," she said. "You can leave if you want. I'm going to continue looking at the roses." A long pause. Then, with a precision that cost him more than the movement suggested, he laid the jacket back across his knee and returned his attention to his reading. Elena turned to the roses. Her heart was doing something it had no useful business doing. She breathed through it, the way her father had taught her to play through a bad hand. No tells, no signals, nothing that the room could use. They stayed in the garden for 20 minutes that way, saying nothing, 6 feet apart, while the autumn light moved slowly across the trellis and the dark roses gave off the particular scent of something beautiful approaching its end. At 3 weeks, she stopped pretending the arrangement was temporary. She'd done what people do in disorienting circumstances. Maintained the internal language of transition, framed everything as provisional, kept one hand on the door in her own mind even while her body established routines and her feet learned the floors. But the West Wing had stopped feeling like a hotel room. The library had stopped feeling borrowed. The kitchen in the mornings had stopped feeling like an intrusion. She was living here. Damien Vescari was her husband in the only legal sense that word could be applied to a contract signed at 3 a.m. with shaking hands. And the man was not what she'd been told. She wasn't naive enough to think that the rest of it, the organization, the violence that kept his name from being challenged, the machinery of power that had allowed him to purchase a dead man's debt and a living woman's signature, was anything other than what it was. She wasn't constructing a comfortable fiction around his complexity. She was holding both things at once. The man who'd cataloged the fall roses because they were the ones that lasted, and the man in whose name people were afraid. Both were real. She knew which one she was living with and which one existed in the broader world, and she understood that the wall between those two realities was not hers to break or cross. But she was still paying attention. She couldn't stop doing that. The security chief arrived on a Thursday, Adrian Knox, 34, compact and watchful in the way of someone who processes spatial information continuously and automatically. He moved through the house doing whatever he did on Thursdays, and Elena passed him twice in the halls and received a nod both times that was respectful in a way that wasn't quite familiarity. She was being assessed. She understood that and didn't find it offensive. In his position, she would have done the same. She found him in the kitchen at 2 p.m. making coffee with the focused efficiency of someone who had elevated a routine task to tactical precision. She said, "You've worked for him a long time, 7 years," he said. He didn't pause what he was doing before the accident. He looked at her then. The word accident didn't escape his notice, and she watched him file it, the choice of that word rather than another. "Yes," he said, "before." Was it a difficult transition? For who? For the organization. She stopped herself. He waited. Having a man in his position who can't always be physically present in the way he used to be, she finished. Adrian poured his coffee. He looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly and not warm and was, she thought, honest in its restraint. "The organization follows Damien Vescari," he said. "Not a version of him. He's had 3 formal challenges in the 2 years since the assassination attempt. All 3 are no longer in a position to challenge anyone. Elena looked at her coffee cup. He doesn't need to be in a room for people to be afraid of him, Adrian said. He paused. He never did. Elena nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. He took his coffee and left. She sat in the kitchen alone and thought about a man who had been shot, who was managing an untreated wound on his arm, who navigated his house by memory, who had told a woman he'd purchased through a legal contract that the single condition he required was honesty, and who had 3 formal challenges in the last 2 years that had ended in a way Adrian Knox described with careful precision as no longer in a position. She thought about all of this for a long time. Then she thought about Marco Salvi, Damien's underboss, who had been present at the one formal dinner she'd attended in her first weeks here, who had smiled at her with the automatic ease of someone performing charm rather than feeling it, whose eyes had moved around the room in a pattern she'd registered and filed without knowing why, who had asked her, very casually, 3 specific questions about her weekly routines: what time she walked the gardens, whether she ventured outside the estate grounds, what her preferences were regarding visitors. She'd answered because they were casual questions asked over dinner by a man who was apparently someone Damien trusted in a professional capacity. She'd answered, and then, lying in bed that night, she'd replayed the questions and felt a slow, cold clarity about the way they'd been structured. They hadn't been social questions. They had been intelligence gathering. She didn't say anything yet. She didn't have enough to say it with. But she began paying attention to Marco Salvi the way she'd been paying attention to everything else in this house. Carefully, completely, without showing it. 1. On the 28th day, Sienna arrived. Elena had been half expecting it. Sienna Brooks operated on a principle of showing up wherever she felt she was needed, and she'd been giving Elena what she called reasonable adjustment time before descending with the full force of her presence. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in a red coat with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone conducting a welfare check they were trying to disguise as a social call. Elena let her in and gave her the tour and watched Sienna recalibrate her assumptions in real time with the particular efficiency of someone whose assumptions were usually accurate and therefore rarely needed significant revision. This is insane, Sienna said, in the library, looking at the walls of books. Yes, this is an actual library, in a house. Rich people have libraries. He's not just rich, Sienna said. She turned. I looked him up. I know what he is. And I live here now. Sienna looked at her. Elena, what? I'm fine, Elena said. She said it with enough precision that Sienna understood it was not a deflection, but an answer. I'm actually fine. I'm not going to explain all of it right now, but I'm fine. Sienna studied her for a moment. Okay, she said. She opened the wine. But you're going to tell me at some point. At some point, Elena agreed. Marco appeared at dinner. Elena had told Sienna he was an associate, which was accurate and insufficient, and she watched Sienna engage him in conversation with the open brightness that was Sienna's natural mode, and felt, with quiet alarm, Marco's attention sharpening in a way that had nothing to do with Sienna herself. He was watching, through Sienna, for information about Elena. What did her friend know? What access did she have? What represented a pressure point? Elena reached for her water glass and looked down the table at the only person in the room she wanted to look at. Damien was seated at the head, composed and precise as always, conducting the dinner with the minimal social effort of someone whose presence filled a room without requiring performance. He wasn't looking at Marco. He wasn't looking at Elena. But something in the set of his jaw told her he was listening to everything. She found the injury by accident on the 35th day. She'd been wrong about the bandage on his arm. She'd assumed it was an old wound, something from the assassination attempt, something being managed chronically. She was wrong. She found out because he didn't come to the kitchen in the morning on day 35. And by 8 o'clock, she'd noted his absence, and by 9 o'clock, she'd decided it was not her concern. And by 10 o'clock, she was walking past the East Corridor for a reason she'd manufactured, but wouldn't have been able to articulate honestly, and she heard it, the particular sound of someone breathing through pain with controlled, deliberate breaths, the kind that are maintenance rather than crisis. She knocked on the East Room door. No answer. She opened it. He was in the chair by the window, and he was not reading, and he was not conducting any business. He was simply sitting, and the pallor of his face was not something she'd seen in the 35 days before this. And the jacket, that was usually precise and immaculate, was draped across the arm of the chair rather than on him, and the bandage was different. The wrong color, the wrong thickness. Not managing. She crossed the room and said, "Let me see." "Don't," he said. "That is not a response to what I asked." He looked up at her. His eyes were very sharp, but the sharpness was effort, the focused intensity of someone working to maintain a presentation. "Ms. Moreau, my name is Elena," she said. "You've known that for 35 days." She crouched beside the chair, which put her below his eye line, and she looked at the arm without touching it. The bandage had been changed recently, but not well. There was seepage. There was heat visible in the skin above the bandage that she could see without touching. "This is infected," she said. "It's being managed." "Not well. I don't require—" "You have a fever," she said. She could see it in the slight shine of perspiration, the faint color high on his cheekbones that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "How long?" His jaw tightened. "Elena, how long has the fever been present?" she repeated. The silence stretched. She waited it out, crouched beside his chair, looking at him steadily. She'd learned that waiting was more effective than pressing with Damien Vescari. Pressing activated resistance. Waiting activated something else. "Since yesterday evening," he said finally. She stood. "Where's the medical kit?" "Elena, where is it?" The silence again, shorter this time. Third drawer from the left in the cabinet behind the door. She found it. It was extraordinarily well stocked. Not a house kit, but something closer to a professional trauma kit, which told her everything she needed to know about the frequency with which things like this occurred. She brought it to the window. She pulled a chair beside his. She looked at him. He could stop her. She understood that clearly. The authority in this room was not hers. But he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. It was not anger, and it was not the cold control she'd learned to expect, and it was not the warmth she'd caught in glimpses of which he seemed only partially aware. It was something adjacent to exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, the other kind. He extended his arm. She worked carefully. The wound was not catastrophic. It was a graze, possibly from something she didn't want to calculate the origin of, that had been inadequately cleaned and subsequently neglected. The infection was real but early. She cleaned it properly, applied what was available in the kit, redressed it with more precision than the previous wrapping. He didn't look away while she worked. She kept her eyes on her hands. When she finished, she said, "You need antibiotics, actual ones. I'll have someone tell me which ones and I'll have Victor get them today." He told her. She wrote them down. She looked at him. She said, "You should sleep. I have work. The work will be there tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, quiet in a way she hadn't heard from him before, stripped of the control that was usually present in even his most careful statements. "Why?" She understood what he was asking. Not why the antibiotics, not why she'd intervened, why any of it. Why she was here, beside his chair, in the East Room she'd been told he didn't allow witnesses in. She thought about the honest answer. The contract had required honesty. She thought about what was true. "Because you're not actually terrible," she said. "And I don't want you to die from a preventable infection when I could have done something about it." Something moved through his expression. It was very quick, and he controlled it. She could see him do it. The deliberate return to composure, the pulling back from whatever edge he'd briefly been at. But she'd seen it. She filed it the same way she'd filed everything else about him. She stood. She said, "I'll have the antibiotics within 2 hours." She went to find Victor. Behind her, in the East Room, Damien Vescari sat very still and looked out the window at the garden, and the roses that would last until the first hard frost, and the life that had somehow, in 35 days, become something he was less certain about than any variable he'd ever been asked to calculate. The antibiotics worked, as antibiotics will when caught early enough. The fever broke by the following evening. Elena knew this not because she checked. She had left the medication with Victor and returned to her wing and her routines and the book she was midway through, but because on the morning of day 37, Damien appeared in the kitchen at 6:45 with his customary precision, his color restored, his composure fully reassembled, and set a small box on the table beside her coffee cup before taking his seat and opening his documents. She looked at the box. It was a single bakery pastry from a shop she'd mentioned in passing on the second morning as the only thing in her former neighborhood she genuinely missed. She looked at him. He was reading. He said nothing. She ate the pastry. She said nothing. But something in the kitchen that morning was calibrated differently. Not warmer exactly. Not softer, but less defended. The space between them had changed in a way that didn't have a clean vocabulary, and both of them knew it, and both of them left it without naming it because naming it would have required one of them to take a step neither was prepared yet to take. Outside, in the far section of the garden, the dark burgundy roses swayed in the early morning wind, still open, still persisting, unbothered by the approaching cold. Elena watched them through the kitchen window while Damien's documents rustled softly beside her. In the West Wing hallway, beyond the closed door of the kitchen, Marco Salvi's footsteps moved past with the particular quiet of someone who was not simply walking, but listening, memorizing, and preparing something that he had not yet decided to show his hand about. Elena couldn't hear those footsteps from where she sat. Not yet. But somewhere in the house, at the far end of the east corridor, the door to the room that held the security monitors was open, and the man who watched those monitors had been watching Marco Salvi for longer than Marco understood, and the expression on Adrian Knox's face as he reviewed the previous night's footage had the careful, certain look of a man who had already identified the thing before him and was simply waiting for the right moment to tell his employer what he knew. The roses moved in the wind. The pastry was exactly what she'd remembered, and Damien Viscari sat 4 feet from the woman who had cleaned his wound and asked for nothing in return, and turned a page in his document and said absolutely nothing, and felt for the first time in 2 years something faint and dangerous and entirely unwelcome. He felt it, and he turned another page, and he let the morning continue because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was acknowledging it, and he had not yet found a version of himself capable of doing that without losing something essential in the process. Outside, Marco Salvi's phone buzzed in his pocket with a message from a number not saved in his contacts. He read it in the hallway. He typed a brief response. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and smoothed the front of it, and continued down the hall with a smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. The roses moved in this wind, and the morning held, and none of them knew yet what was coming, except that it was coming, and that when it arrived, nothing inside those iron gates would be the same. The pastry box stayed on the kitchen counter for 2 days before Elena threw it away, and she was annoyed at herself for keeping it that long. That was the thing about small gestures from people you were trying not to feel anything about. They accumulated. They built weight without asking permission. The box was nothing, a cardboard rectangle that cost maybe $4, and she'd kept it on the counter the way you keep a receipt you don't have a reason to keep, not knowing what you're waiting for. She threw it away on day 39. She was more decisive after that, or she tried to be. The shift between them was real, but neither of them named it, and the not naming of it created its own particular tension, a pressure in rooms they occupied together, a new precision in how they moved around each other that was not avoidance but was its opposite, a heightened awareness operating just below the level of acknowledgement. Damien spoke to her more at breakfast. Not much more. The increments were small. He mentioned the Philadelphia City Council's ongoing failure to manage the waterfront development corridor as though commenting on weather. He asked once whether she'd found anything useful in the library on the restoration techniques she'd mentioned being interested in during their second week. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, while reaching past him for a book, and he had apparently cataloged it the way he cataloged everything. She said yes. He nodded. He went back to his documents. She sat with her coffee and thought, this man has a memory like a locked room where nothing decays. It should have been unsettling. Instead, she found it, in a way she was not ready to examine closely, a strange form of being seen. The physical therapy sessions on Tuesdays and Fridays happened in a room on the ground floor east wing that Elena had not been invited into. She respected that boundary without resentment. What she noticed, because she noticed everything now in this house, was the way Damien moved in the hours following those sessions. With a particular quality of suppressed effort, like a man who has done something painful and is now performing the absence of that pain for an audience he refuses to admit he's aware of. On a Tuesday in the 6th week, she passed the therapy room at the wrong moment. The door was slightly ajar. She wasn't listening. She heard anyway. the therapist's steady voice counting repetitions, and beneath it, Damien's breathing, which was not the measured, controlled rhythm she'd heard from him in every other context, but something raw, work breath, the kind that cost something. She walked past. She didn't slow down, but she stopped in the library and stood with her hands flat on the reading table and breathed through something that was not pity and was not admiration and was not comfortable to feel, and was, she understood clearly, the beginning of something she had not been given the option to negotiate. Pots, Sienna called that afternoon. I need to tell you something, Elena said before Sienna could start. You first then. Marco Salvi, the underboss. What about him? He asked me questions, Elena said. First week I was here, at dinner. I thought they were social questions. They weren't. The pause on Sienna's end had a quality of recalibration. What kind of questions? Routine questions. My schedule. Whether I left the property. Whether I had frequent visitors. She paused. Whether I'd be having you over. Sienna was quiet for a long moment. He asked about me specifically. He asked whether I had close friends who visited. I mentioned you. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now you do. Now I do, Elena said. I want you to be careful. If he contacts you, through any channel, for any reason, I want you to tell me immediately and not respond to him directly. You think he's dangerous. I think he smiles like someone who's practiced it. Okay, Sienna said. She said it with a steadiness that was one of the things Elena loved most about her. The ability to receive alarming information and process it without performance. Okay, what are you going to do? I'm watching, Elena said. I don't have enough yet. Enough for what? Enough to say something to Damien that means anything. Another pause. You're going to tell him when I have something real. Yes. She heard Sienna absorbing this. Then Sienna said carefully, You trust him. Elena looked out the library window at the garden, at the far section where the dark roses were thinning now, some of them gone to the cold, a few still holding. I trust his word, she said. He told me to tell him the truth. I believe he meant it. That's not exactly the same thing. I know, Elena said. Marco appeared 3 more times that week in spaces where Elena had no particular reason to expect him. Once in the east sitting room when she was reading and he came through on his way to somewhere else, pausing to exchange pleasantries with a warmth that operated entirely on the surface. Once in the kitchen when she was making tea, asking whether she'd been adjusting well, whether the house was feeling more like home, whether she'd had opportunities to see the city, the questions landing with the specific weight of someone assembling a profile. And once, on Friday afternoon from the upper window of the West Hall, she watched him speaking on a phone at the far edge of the grounds, near the gate, in a position that maximized distance from the estate's interior cameras. She'd learned where those cameras were positioned from Adrian without asking directly. She'd simply spent time with the house, the way you spend time learning a language, through accumulation rather than instruction. She knew the coverage gaps, the sight angles, the 2 positions on the grounds from which a person could operate without being recorded. Marco was standing in one of them. She watched him for 3 minutes until he finished the call, slipped the phone into his jacket, and walked back toward the house with the relaxed pace of someone returning from a cigarette break. He didn't smoke. She'd noticed that on day 1. She went downstairs and found Adrian in the security room. She said, How long have you been watching him? Adrian looked at her without expression. A short silence. Then, What makes you think I'm watching him? Because you watch everything, she said. And because he's standing in your camera blind spots when he makes calls on a phone I've never seen him use at dinner or in the house. Adrian's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Miss Moreau. He asked me about my schedule in my first week, she said. Structured questions. Intelligence questions. I should have said something sooner. I'm saying it now. The silence stretched. Adrian looked at the monitors. He looked back at her. 3 weeks, he said finally. Give or take. He's been using a secondary phone since before your arrival. We've been building the picture. You haven't told Damien. We don't tell Mr. Viscari something like this until we know what it is. She looked at him. And now you know what it is. Adrian said nothing. We need to tell him, she said. I'm aware. Soon. Adrian looked at the monitors for a long moment. His jaw was tight. The expression was the particular look of a man with incomplete information about a situation he is nonetheless certain about in his instincts. Tomorrow, he said. I'll have enough tomorrow to put in front of him. Tonight, she said. He looked at her. If Marco is already selling information, every additional day is exposure. She held his gaze. You know that. Adrian was still. Then he stood slowly, with the deliberate movement of someone arriving at a decision. He said, Give me 2 hours. Don't speak to Mr. Vescari before I do. She nodded. She left. Fell out. She spent those 2 hours in the West Wing sitting room with a book she didn't read. She sat in the chair and held the book and listened to the house. The sounds it made, the footsteps that moved through it, the distant, low exchange of voices from the East Wing that meant Adrian had gone to Damien and the conversation was happening. She thought about what came after that conversation. Damien had built his organization on information. He would process what Adrian brought him the way he processed everything. Precisely, without panic, assigning to each fact its correct weight and responding accordingly. He would be careful. He would be controlled. He would be furious. She understood that without needing to witness it. Not the theatrical fury of insecure men, but the cold, absolute rage of someone who had trusted and been used, and the difference between those two things was the difference between fire you could manage and fire that had already decided where it was going. She was on page 12 of the unread book when her door opened without a knock. It was Damien. He came in 3 feet and stopped. He was in his chair and his face had the particular expression she'd described to herself as controlled. The tight jaw, the absolute stillness, the eyes that were doing something they didn't usually do, which was show something. Not what was underneath it, the pressure of what was underneath it. How long, he said. She set the book down. The week I arrived. He asked about my schedule, my visitors, my movements outside the estate. I didn't understand what it was at the time, and when you did, I started watching him, and then I saw Adrian watching him, and I went to Adrian 3 days ago and told him what I'd observed. He wanted to build a complete picture before bringing it to you. I told him tonight. Damien looked at her. The silence in the room was dense. You told me you'd tell me the truth. I'm telling you now. You waited. I waited until I had something that meant something. She met his eyes. If I'd come to you in the first week with an impression, a feeling, a poorly remembered dinner conversation, what would you have done with that? The question landed. She watched him process it. He said nothing for a moment, then, What did you see at the camera position? She told him, the phone, the placement, the duration of the calls, the timing relative to her own schedule movements. His jaw tightened fractionally. You know where my camera positions are. I know how to read a house. Something crossed his face. Not the warmth she'd seen glimpses of, not the control. Something between them, something that had no clean name. He said very quietly, I need you to stay in the West Wing tonight. Don't open the door for anyone except Victor or Adrian. She said, What are you going to do? Handle it. Damien. He had already turned. He moved toward the door with the focused momentum of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it, and the discussion portion of the evening is complete. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn back. You did the right thing, he said. His voice was level and precise, and carried something underneath it that she couldn't have named out loud, but felt in the base of her sternum. The telling. Then he was gone. The sitting room was very quiet. Elena put the book on the side table. She looked at her hands, and they were steady. She waited for the fear to arrive, the practical fear of consequence, of having moved something irreversible. And what came instead was something more complicated and harder to manage, which was the particular feeling of having been, for the first time in a very long time, in a situation where honesty had been asked for and given and received by someone whose word about what they'd do with it she actually believed. She sat with that feeling in the quiet sitting room while the house moved around her in ways she could hear but not see. And outside the window, the last of the dark roses shuddered in the night wind, and somewhere on the other side of the estate, Marco Salvi was sitting down to dinner with no idea that the walls had already closed. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and heard the sounds of the house, which were different tonight, more footsteps than usual, A door closing in the east wing with more force than usual, the low register of voices she couldn't parse. At 2 in the morning, she heard a car on the drive, then 2 more. At 2:40, she heard something that might have been an argument at the far end of the ground floor, or might have been nothing. The house settled into silence around 3, the particular silence that follows the end of a thing rather than the silence of a thing not yet started. She got up at 4 and made coffee. She was standing at the kitchen window watching the dark garden when Damien appeared at 5:15, which was earlier than she'd seen him. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. He moved to the coffee maker, poured what she'd already made, and stood with the cup held in both hands the way people hold hot things when their hands need something to do. She waited. He said, "Marco has been feeding intelligence to the Carbone family since 3 months before you arrived." She absorbed that. The timeline. Before the marriage contract, he said. He was already in contact with them. Your arrival gave him additional material, your schedule, your visitor habits, the estate's soft points. She watched his face. He was looking at the coffee. "What are you going to do with him?" she said. "I already did it," he said. His voice was even, professional. The voice that managed the distance between what a thing required and what it cost. He looked up at her. "It's handled." She understood what that meant. She didn't ask him to expand it. She nodded, once, and turned back to the window. They stood together in the kitchen in the 4-color early morning light, the gray garden outside going gradually lighter, and didn't speak for a long time. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who have just passed through something together and are still on the other side of the adrenaline, still in the physical fact of aftermath. Then Damien said, "There's a second problem." She turned. "The Carbone family has what Marco sold them," he said. 3 months of intelligence about this property. About your movements. They're going to use it. Elena felt the cold clarity of it settle into her chest. When? I don't know the timeline. Adrian is building that picture. He looked at her directly in a way he rarely did, the full, unguarded attention without any protective distance maintained. You need to know this, not because it changes your immediate safety. It doesn't, not inside this estate, but because you're owed the information. She looked at him. She said, All right. She said, "What do you need from me?" He paused. The pause was brief, but she caught it, a fractional interruption in the forward motion of a man who had already planned the next 17 steps. "You've been paying attention to this house since day 1, he said. "You know it better than you should by now." She didn't deny it. If something seems wrong, anything, any detail that doesn't sit right, you tell me, directly, before you process it, before you decide whether it's real. You tell me. She met his eyes. "I will." He nodded. He finished the coffee. He set the cup down with the precise placement of every object he touched in this house. Exactly equidistant, exactly controlled. And then he looked at her once more with an expression that was not the cold composure of the man she'd met in the study on the first night, and was not the exhausted authority of the man who'd just spent a night dismantling a betrayal inside his own organization. It was something she hadn't seen clearly before on him. Not warmth, exactly. That word was too soft for what it was. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who has been careful for a very long time about who they allow into the interior of a thing, and who has just realized, without quite having planned it, that someone is already there. He left the kitchen before she could respond to it. She stood at the window with her coffee cooling in her hands and watched the garden lighten from gray to pale gold, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes in exhausted early mornings when the defenses are down that this was no longer a situation she could manage at the careful remove she'd been maintaining. She was inside it. She had been inside it for a while now. The only question left was whether she was going to stop pretending otherwise, and whether when she did, the thing inside those iron gates that had begun quietly to feel like something worth protecting would be strong enough to survive what was coming, and whether she was ready for the cost of finding out. The answer came 11 days later in the form of a white van parked on the service road behind the estate's eastern perimeter wall. Adrian found it at 6:40 in the morning during the secondary sweep he'd added to the routine 3 days after the Marco situation. He didn't announce it through the house. He called Damien's private line and spoke for 90 seconds, and then he went to the security room and pulled every camera feed from the previous 72 hours and began working backward through the footage with the systematic focus of a man who already knows what he's going to find and is simply locating the precise moment it became real. Elena was in the library when Victor appeared in the doorway. His face was the face of a man managing the distance between what he knows and what he's been instructed to say. "Mr. Vescari would like you to remain inside today," he said. "The east and west gardens are temporarily restricted." She looked at him. "How serious?" Victor said, "Please stay inside, Ms. Moreau." She closed the book. Victor. He met her eyes. "There's a situation developing. Mr. Vescari is handling it. You are not in immediate danger inside this building." She heard what he didn't say, that outside this building was a different calculation. She nodded. She stayed inside. She lasted 40 minutes in the library before the quality of the silence in the East Wing changed, became the particular charged quiet of people moving with deliberate care, voices lowered not out of courtesy, but out of tactical necessity. And she went to the kitchen window and looked at the garden and saw two of Adrian's security detail positioned at the far wall in a stance that was not routine patrol. She went to find Damien. Sit. He was in the study. The chess set was still mid-game on the table, but he was at the desk with 3 different documents spread in front of him, and Adrian standing to his left. And when she opened the door, both men looked at her with the same expression, which was the expression of people who had been in the middle of a conversation they hadn't planned to include her in. She said, "Tell me." Damien looked at Adrian. Adrian's jaw moved slightly. Then Damien said, "Close the door." She closed it. She crossed the room and stood at the opposite side of the desk, which put her inside the conversation rather than at its edge, and she looked at both of them and waited. Damien said, "The Carbone family has deployed a surveillance team on the east perimeter. They've been there for at minimum 4 days. Based on the pattern of observation, they're building a real-time schedule of your movements, garden access, entry and exit points you use regularly, the timing of security rotations." She took that in. "They're not there for you," she said. "No, they're there for me specifically." "Yes." She breathed. The sensation was not panic. Panic was too loose, too unfocused. This was something tighter, more directed. The specific fear of a person who has identified the exact shape of the threat and understands precisely what it intends. She said, "Marco's intelligence. He gave them my schedule. They've been refining it with direct observation." "That's correct," Damien said. "How long before they move?" Adrian answered, "We estimate 72 hours, possibly less." The surveillance pattern has shifted from intelligence gathering to confirmation. They're not learning anymore. They're verifying. Verifying what? "That you'll be in the East Garden at 7:15 tomorrow morning," Adrian said, "which is where you've been every morning for the past 3 weeks, weather permitting." Elena looked at the desk. She thought about 7:15 in the East Garden. The particular low angle of the autumn morning light, the sound of the groundskeeper's tools, the way she stood at the far section with the roses, because the roses were still there, fewer now but still holding, and the position gave her a clear sight line down the length of the garden to the house. She'd chosen it partly for that reason without consciously acknowledging she'd chosen it for that reason. She looked up at Damien. "You're going to use me as bait." The word hung in the room. Adrian's expression didn't shift. Damien looked at her steadily. "That is one operational option," he said. "Is it the best one?" A pause. "It is the most controlled one. Because if we move against the surveillance team before they commit to an action, the Carbone family revises their approach, and we're back to an unknown timeline. If we allow the approach and contain it on our terms, we eliminate the immediate threat entirely. And the risk to me in the second option." Adrian said, "We'd have a full containment team in position before you entered the garden. You'd be covered from every angle. Your window of actual exposure, the time between entering the garden and our engagement, would be under 40 seconds. Elena looked at him. 40 seconds is a long time. He didn't argue with that. She looked at Damien. He was watching her with the expression she'd learned to read in the last weeks. Not the controlled blankness he'd worn in the first days, but the thing underneath the control. The thing that moved behind his eyes when he was calculating and feeling simultaneously and finding those two operations in conflict. His jaw was tight. His hands, flat on the desk, were still. She said, "This is why you told me. This morning in the kitchen, you said I was owed the information, but you also knew you'd need my cooperation." He said, "Both things are true." She appreciated that. She appreciated it more than any version of reassurance would have been. She looked at the documents on his desk, which she could see now were perimeter maps and timing schematics, and something that looked like a communications intercept. Adrian's 72 hours of work, assembled into a package that represented the difference between reacting and controlling. She said, "I'll do it." "Elena, I said I'll do it." She looked at him directly. Brief silence. "But I want to be told everything. Every detail of what you're planning, not a summary, everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. He said, "Sit down." She sat. Adrian began. What? The briefing lasted 2 hours. She asked questions that were specific and structural, the kind of questions that came from actually listening rather than waiting for reassurance. And both men answered them with a precision that told her they'd been correct in their assessment of what she could handle. By the time it was done, she understood the operation as well as anyone in the room who wasn't responsible for executing it, and she felt the strange dual weight of the situation, the fear, which was real and present, and she wasn't pretending otherwise, and beneath it something she could only describe as a grim, focused readiness. She had spent her life managing the gap between what was happening and what she could control within it. This was not so different from that, only the stakes were higher and the players more dangerous, and the man sitting across the desk from her was someone she was no longer capable of being neutral about. She left the study at 2 in the afternoon. She went to her rooms and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself feel all of it for exactly the time it took to breathe through it. The fear, the anger at Marco's casual treachery, the cold fury of being a variable in someone else's calculation, the complicated and unwieldy fact of what she felt when Damien Viscari looked at her across that desk and said, "Both things are true," with the precision of a man who has finally decided that honesty costs less than the alternative. She felt all of it, and then she stood up and washed her face and went back to the library. She read until dinner. She ate alone. At 10 o'clock, she went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about 40 seconds, and the East Garden, and the dark roses that had almost all gone to the cold now. And she slept finally, sometime after midnight. The morning of the operation was clear and cold. October had arrived fully. The light at 7 was thin and precise, coming in at a low angle that made the garden look like a film still, everything sharply defined, the frost on the grass catching it, the remaining roses the darkest things in the frame. Elena dressed carefully. Not for the occasion. There was no version of dressing for this occasion. She dressed the way she dressed every morning, the same coat, the same deliberate attention to the ordinary, because the operation required her to be exactly herself, and anything different would have been visible to people who were watching for difference. She went through the kitchen. Damien was there. He was not reading. He was standing at the counter with a coffee he wasn't drinking. And when she came in, he looked at her with an expression that had none of the protective layering she'd spent weeks learning to read through. It was direct. It was the face of a man who was about to allow a woman he cared about to walk into a controlled danger because it was the best of a set of bad options. And he had built his entire life around making exactly those calculations. And this was the first time in a long time that the calculation had a personal cost he hadn't accounted for. He said nothing. She said nothing. She poured coffee, drank half of it, set the cup down. She said, "I'll see you afterward." He said, "Yes." She walked out of the kitchen and through the east hall and out the side door that opened onto the garden path. The door opened at 7:14. She stepped onto the path at 7:15 exactly, which was what the schedule called for, and began walking toward the far section with the last of the roses. And the morning air was cold enough to see her breath, and somewhere in the trees beyond the east wall, men were watching. And somewhere behind her, the containment team was already moving into position with the silent efficiency that Adrian Knox had spent 7 years building. And somewhere inside the house, a man in a wheelchair was watching a monitor with the particular stillness of someone who has put everything they have on a single outcome and is now simply waiting. She reached the roses. She stopped. She looked at them. The last few. 3 blooms on the far cane, 1 on the trellis post, deep burgundy, almost black in the morning light, frost-edged and refusing. She heard the east wall before she saw anything. A sound that was specific and wrong. Not the wind, not groundskeeper equipment, a weight and direction that didn't belong to the morning's normal inventory. Then Adrian's voice in the earpiece she'd been fitted with in the security room 20 minutes earlier, very quiet. They're moving. Stay exactly where you are. She stayed exactly where she was. The 40 seconds were the longest of her life. She knew that was not objectively true. She had lived through her father's death, and the 12 hours before signing a contract, and the first night in this house, and the night she'd cleaned a wound while a man tried not to show her how much it cost him. She had lived through longer and harder things. But the 40 seconds in the East Garden with the frost-edged roses and the sounds of Adrian's team moving through the wall positions had a specific quality of duration that she would not forget, and she stood in it and breathed and kept her hands at her sides and did not run. It was over in under 40 seconds. She heard it, the organized, efficient sound of a situation being contained by people who were very good at containing situations. One raised voice, cut off. Movement at the wall. Adrian saying, into the earpiece, clear, very calm, very final. She breathed out. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. And she didn't look at the wall, and she didn't look at the garden, and she looked at the door, which was the only thing she needed to look at. And she went through it. Hey, Damien was in the hallway on the other side of the door. Not in the security room, not in the study. In the hallway, 6 feet from the door she'd just come through, with the expression of a man who has been waiting in that hallway for 40 seconds and has not moved and cannot account for why he moved there rather than remaining at the monitor. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her breath was still visible in the cold air she'd brought in with her. She said, "It's done?" He said, "It's done." She nodded. She became aware, in the aftermath of the adrenaline, that her hands were shaking slightly. Not much. She looked at them with the detached curiosity of someone noting a physical fact. Then Damien said, with a roughness in his voice she hadn't heard before, something that had gotten past the control, something that had been there for 40 seconds while he was in that hallway not moving. "Come here." She looked up. He said, "Elena, come here." She crossed the 3 feet between them and he took her hands, both of them, his grip firm and warm and certain in the way everything he did physically was certain. And the shaking in her hands stopped, and she stood there in the east hallway with the cold morning light coming through the window at the end of the corridor, and she thought with perfect clarity, "I am not pretending anymore. I have not been pretending for a long time." She looked at his hands holding hers. She looked up at his face. There was no distance there, none of the controlled blankness, none of the protective management, just him. Looking at her with the fullness of attention that she'd felt since the beginning and had been calling something else because calling it what it was required courage, she'd been rationing. He said, "You were terrified," she said. "Yes. I was also fine." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a full expression. It didn't need to be. She said, "Because it was true, and because the contract had required honesty, and she had decided to honor that requirement at the highest possible level. I don't know when it happened, when this became something I couldn't manage from the outside." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know when it happened for me." She waited. "When you put the vase back," he said, without saying anything about it. She laughed. It came out slightly broken, the laugh of a person emerging from concentrated fear into unexpected warmth, but it was real and he heard it, and something in his face opened in response to it. Something she didn't have a word for because she had never seen it on him before. Then he pulled her in, and she let him, and she pressed her forehead against the side of his face and closed her eyes. And for a moment in the east hallway of the Vescaria estate, with the containment team working at the perimeter wall and the frost retreating from the grass and the last dark roses holding at the far end of the garden, two people who had been careful for their entire lives allowed themselves to be, very briefly, something other than careful. It lasted 30 seconds, maybe less. He pulled back first, which she understood. The controlled withdrawal, the man reasserting the structure he'd built. But when he didn't release her hands immediately, and she didn't move away. And the space between them was entirely different from every version of the space between them that had existed before this morning. He said, "There's still the Carbone family to address." "I know," she said. He said, "When it's over." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. She held it. She held all of it. The fear that was still metabolizing, the warmth that was still settling, the cold understanding that the operation at the wall had contained one threat and not the source of it, and the source was still operational and still held everything Marco had sold them, and the reckoning that was coming had not yet arrived. But they had made it through the morning. They had both kept their word. And the thing that had been growing in the space between them since a vase on a hall table and a pastry box, and 40 minutes on a cold floor and a first night in a study where a man told a woman that the only thing he required was the truth, that thing was now visible, undeniable, and neither of them was pretending it wasn't there. Adrian appeared at the end of the hall. He looked at them both with the careful non-expression of a man who has seen something and filed it and will never mention it unless directly asked. He said, "Sir, we need to talk about the Carbone family's response timeline." Damien released her hands. He looked at her once more, the look carrying everything that wasn't going to be said in front of Adrian, in a hallway, in the immediate aftermath. Then he turned toward Adrian. Elena stood in the hallway and listened to them begin, and she pressed one hand flat against the cold wall beside her and felt the solid reality of the stone, and understood that whatever came next, she was not in this alone, and she was not behind glass anymore, and the door she had been standing next to since the beginning had been open the entire time, and she had simply, finally, walked through it. The Carbone family's response came in 48 hours, not 72. Adrian had predicted the shorter timeline as a secondary possibility, that the failure of the surveillance team would accelerate rather than abort, that the Carbone organization would interpret the loss of their perimeter crew as confirmation that the window was closing and move before Viscari could fully consolidate his counterposition. He'd laid that scenario out in the study 2 days after the garden operation, spread across the desk in the form of intercept analysis and movement pattern projections. And Damien had listened with the focused stillness of someone absorbing information they already partially knew. He'd said, "They'll come for her directly." Adrian had said, "Yes." He'd said, "Where?" Adrian had said, "Not here. They've lost the perimeter. They know we've hardened the estate. They'll look for a gap, a moment when she's outside the controlled environment." Damien had looked at the desk. Elena had been in the library. Neither of them had said what both of them understood, that the gap didn't currently exist, that Elena had not left the estate grounds since her arrival, that the Carbone family was therefore in the position of needing to create the gap rather than exploit one, which meant they would find a way to make her leave. The call came on a Thursday morning at 8:47. Elena was in the kitchen. Her phone, which she'd kept charged and close since the garden operation, rang with Sienna's number, and she answered it before the second ring. Sienna's voice was wrong. Not wrong in the way of someone in immediate danger, but wrong in the subtler way of someone trying to sound normal and not entirely succeeding. The slightly elevated pace, the breath that came in before the sentence rather than through it. "Hey," Sienna said. Elena said, "Where are you right now?" A pause. "I'm at my apartment. I'm fine. Something happened last night, and I didn't know if I should call, but I figured..." "Sienna, where exactly are you?" "My apartment, living room. The door's locked. Did something happen to you or near you?" "Near me." She exhaled. "Someone was outside my building last night, 3 in the morning, standing at the entrance, looking up. My neighbor mentioned it this morning," described the guy. Elena. She described him as someone she'd seen before. "At my building. On the 2 nights after I visited you at the estate." Elena stood very still. She turned from the window and looked at the kitchen wall. She said, "You're going to stay in your apartment. You're going to lock the door and not open it for anyone you don't personally know. And you're going to call me every hour until I tell you otherwise. You're scaring me." "Good. Stay scared. It'll keep you in the apartment." She hung up. She went directly to the study. Damien looked up when she came in. He read her face before she spoke. He said, "Tell me." She told him. Every word of it, the exact content of the call, the 3 nights of observed presence at Sienna's building, the timeline that mapped precisely to the days following the garden operation. She spoke quickly and completely and without editorial, the way she'd learned to bring him information, raw, sequenced, nothing omitted. When she finished, he said, "They're going to use her." "Yes." He looked at Adrian, who had come in behind Elena and was already on his own phone. Damien said, "They don't need to take Sienna. They need Elena to come out." Adrian, phone still at his ear, said, "Confirmed. We need to move her." "Move Sienna here," Elena said. She looked at Damien. "Bring her inside the estate. Then there's no gap to exploit. They can't use her if she's inside. It also concentrates the target, Damien said. It also closes the gap permanently. She looked at him. They want me outside. If I stay inside and Sienna comes here, they have nothing. Damien looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible in his expression. Not cold, not removed, the actual working of a mind that processed risk and structures and was right now restructuring. He said, "Get her here. Adrian." "Already on it," Adrian said, and left the room. Elena looked at Damien. His jaw was set. She said, "How close are we to moving against them directly?" He said, 48 hours. We've been building the operational picture. The warehouse on the waterfront is their staging point. The intercepts confirmed it last night. When we move, it ends there. She said, 48 hours. He looked at her. Yes. She nodded. She turned to go. He said, Elena. She stopped. He said, when this is over, I know, she said. She'd said it before. She meant it the same way now. Not dismissal, but a promise, a held space. She said 48 hours, she left. Bashan. Sienna arrived at the estate at 11:15 with a bag she'd packed in 20 minutes, and the expression of someone who had been scared and was managing it by being extremely practical about everything. Elena met her at the door. They stood in the entrance and Sienna looked at her and said, Okay, I believe you now that you're fine, but I need you to explain everything. Elena explained everything. She sat with Sienna in the West Wing sitting room for 90 minutes and told her the full architecture of it. Marco, the intelligence that had been sold, the Carbone family, the garden operation, the 40 seconds, what had happened in the East hallway afterward, all of it, without softening or selective omission. Sienna listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered and asked 4 questions, all of which were specific and useful and cut directly to the operational core rather than the emotional one. At the end, she said, You're in love with him. Elena looked at the window. I'm in a complex situation. That's not a denial. No, Elena said. It isn't. Sienna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is he? Elena thought about the East hallway, the hands, the roughness in his voice when the control had slipped, when it happened for me. She said, I think so. Yes. Sienna absorbed this. She said, Does that make things better or worse? Elena said, Both, significantly both. Sienna nodded. She looked around the sitting room. The good lamp, the reading chair, the shelves that Elena had filled over the weeks with books that were now specifically hers rather than borrowed. She said, You put things on the shelves. Elena looked at them. Yes, that means you stopped thinking of yourself as temporary. Elena didn't answer. Sienna looked at her with the expression that meant she'd already reached her conclusion and was simply waiting for Elena to reach it in her own time. The 48 hours came apart in 30. Adrian came to find Elena at 6 in the evening of the following day, and she knew from the way he moved, the particular compression of his usual efficiency, everything pulled tighter, that the timeline had changed. He said, The Carbone family moved their operation forward. They're at the warehouse now, full assembly. We have a window of 3 hours before they disperse, and we lose the consolidated target. Elena said, Damien knows. He told me to tell you. He's preparing to move in the next 30 minutes. She looked at him. He's going. Adrian said yes. She said, In what capacity? A pause. He'll be operational, in the vehicle. He'll direct from the vehicle. He's done it before, after the assassination attempt, twice. He doesn't need to be mobile in the same way his team does. His presence matters for the men, for the statement it makes. She said, He's going to try to stand. Adrian looked at her steadily. He said nothing. She said, He told me he regained some movement in the weeks after the garden operation, during the therapy sessions. He mentioned it once at breakfast, almost incidentally, the way he mentions things he's decided to mention rather than things that come out naturally. Adrian said, He has been standing, with support. The recovery has been faster than anticipated. She understood then why Damien hadn't made more of it. Not because it wasn't significant, but because he'd learned not to build on hope before it was structural. He'd been testing the ground the way he tested everything, methodically, without announcement, unwilling to let anyone see him fail at something before he'd established he could do it. She said, "I want to see him before he leaves." Adrian said he expected that. He was in the East Room when she found him. Not in the wheelchair, standing beside it, one hand resting on its arm with the particular quality of a man who has decided that the prop and the support are not the same thing. He was in dark clothing. The cane was against the wall to his left. He was standing without it, not steadily. The effort was visible in the set of his shoulders, the slight unevenness of his weight distribution. But he was standing, and he looked at her when she came in without reaching for the cane, maintaining it, and the expression on his face was the concentrated focus of someone doing two things at once that each require everything. She said, "You should take the cane." "I am taking the cane. Right now you're standing without it to show me something." His jaw moved. He said, "I need to know I can do this." "You can do it with the cane," she said. "You don't have to do it without anything to prove it's real." Something moved through his expression. He reached for the cane. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close, eye level now because he was standing, and the difference in the dynamic was immediate and physical, and neither of them acknowledged it directly except in the way they were both very still. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. She said, "Come back." He said, "I intend to." She said, "That's not the same thing as a promise." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll come back." She nodded. She put one hand flat against his chest. Not an embrace, not a formal gesture. Something direct and simple, feeling his heartbeat under her palm for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped back. He watched her do it. He said nothing. He said everything. But the convoy left at 7:42. 3 vehicles, dark, moving through the Philadelphia evening toward the waterfront with the particular authority of vehicles that don't expect to be stopped and aren't. Elena stood at the window of the east corridor and watched the taillights until the gate closed, and then she went to the security room and sat beside the 2 men Adrian had left on the monitors and watched the feeds. She didn't speak. She didn't pace. She sat in the chair and watched the screens and breathed with the measured control of a woman who had learned over the last several weeks that composure was not the absence of fear, but the decision to be useful despite it. The warehouse on the waterfront was a converted cold storage facility, abandoned in the formal sense and operational in every other. The Carbone family had been using it as a coordination point for 6 months. Adrian's intercepts showed the pattern, the traffic, the communication signatures that mapped to the building's loading bay coordinates with enough specificity to act on. The convoy stopped 2 blocks out. Damien was in the second vehicle. He opened the door before the driver completed the stop. Adrian beside him said, "Sir, I'm getting out," Damien said. They had this conversation, or a version of it, before every operation since the assassination attempt. Adrian had learned that the conclusion was always the same and that his function was not to prevent it but to manage it. He came around the vehicle. He stood at Damien's shoulder as Damien placed the cane and stood on the street and looked at the warehouse with the expression he wore when he was calculating and the calculation was already complete. The team was already moving, 12 men, coordinated, taking positions at the building's entry points with the efficiency of people who trained for exactly this. The communications in Damien's earpiece were the precise, rapid shorthand of an operation that had been briefed correctly and was executing cleanly. He walked, not fast, not slow. The cane on wet pavement made a particular sound, solid, deliberate, each placement intentional. Adrian matched his pace on the left. 2 of the security detail flanked them at a distance that was protection without being a display of limitation. The warehouse door was open by the time they reached it. Not forced. The entry team had made entry 30 seconds before, and the situation inside had been controlled in the rapid, definitive way that Adrian's people controlled situations. What was left, as Damien crossed the threshold into the warehouse's cold interior with its smell of salt water and old machinery and recent occupancy, was the specific scene of an operation at the stage past action. Men positioned, perimeter held, and at the center of the loading bay floor, seated on a chair that had not been there before the entry team arrived, hands secured, face composed with the particular composure of a man who had expected to be the one sitting in the elevated position and found himself in the opposite. Carmine Reyes, the Carbone family's operational director, 52 years old, The man whose name had appeared on every intercept as the architect of everything that had been done against Elena's safety. Reyes looked at Damien crossing the warehouse floor. He watched the cane. He watched Damien's face. He did the calculation that men in his position always do, the rapid reassessment of the power in the room, the attempt to find a new leverage point, the falling back on the last available position, which was composure. He said, Vescari. Damien stopped 6 feet from him. He said nothing. He simply looked at Reyes with the expression that Adrian Knox had once described to someone who'd asked as the reason 3 formal challenges in 2 years had resolved the way they had. Not anger, not threat. Something beyond both. The absolute certainty of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply giving the other person the courtesy of the moment before it arrives. Reyes said, "You move faster than we. You sold intelligence on my wife," Damien said. His voice was level, precise, a single quiet register that carried in the warehouse's cold acoustics with complete clarity. "You paid a man inside my organization to gather it. You put a surveillance team at my perimeter. You used her friend to create a gap." He paused. "All of this to build leverage against me." Reyes said nothing. Damien said, "What did you think leverage against her would accomplish?" Reyes looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. He said, "Nobody knew she mattered to you. That wasn't the original read. The original read was a contract wife, a legal arrangement. We thought—" He stopped. "You thought she was a liability," Damien said. "Something I'd trade to avoid disruption." Reyes was quiet. Damien said, "Tell me who authorized the Carbone operation against her." Reyes looked at the floor. "I'm going to ask you once more," Damien said. He moved the cane forward 6 inches and stopped. "Who authorized it?" Reyes looked up. His face had the expression of a man performing the last calculation of consequence. He said, "The authorization came from above me. The family made a strategic decision. I executed it." "Who specifically?" Damien said. And Reyes, who had spent 30 years in a world where the people who gave orders were protected by the people who executed them, looked at the man standing in front of him with a cane on a wet warehouse floor and understood, with the clarity that comes at the end of things, that the protection he had expected was not present in this room, and the name he had been prepared to protect was not worth what protecting it was going to cost him. He said the name. Damien listened. He was still. He said, "Thank you." He turned. He said to Adrian without looking back, "Handle it." He walked toward the warehouse door. The cane on the concrete floor, step, placement, step. The team parted for him. The cold waterfront air came in through the open bay door, and he walked through it and out into the night, and the sound behind him was brief and final, and he did not look back. He stood on the waterfront with the Delaware River dark and wide in front of him and the lights of the city behind him, and he put his weight on the cane and breathed the cold air and felt something in his left leg that he had been cataloging for 3 weeks with the careful restraint of someone who has learned not to trust hope before it's structural, something that was in the specific physical language of the body, unmistakable. He shifted his weight. He lifted the cane 2 inches off the ground. He stood for 4 seconds without it. He placed it back down. He breathed. Adrian came through the door behind him, stood beside him, looked at the river. After a long moment, Damien said, "She said to come back." Adrian said, "Then we should go." Damien looked at the river for one more moment. Then he turned toward the vehicle and began the walk back, the cane on wet pavement marking each step with the particular sound of something deliberate and certain and no longer afraid of the ground it was crossing. Bam. The convoy returned at 11:43. Elena heard the gate before she heard the vehicles. The particular mechanical sound of it opening, which she had memorized in the same way she'd memorized the floorboard in the east corridor and the precise angle of the kitchen window and every other detail of this house that had become, without her formally deciding it, the architecture of her daily life. She was in the security room with the 2 monitors Adrian had left, and she had been in that room for 4 hours and 16 minutes. And when the gate sound came through the speaker, she stood up before she consciously decided to stand. One of the monitors turned to look at her. She was already at the door. She didn't run. She walked through the East Hall with the deliberate pace of someone managing the gap between what their body wants to do and what composure requires. And she reached the entrance hall as the front door opened and the first of Adrian's men came through. and then Adrian himself. And then, with the cane on the marble floor, the measured step, the dark jacket carrying the cold of the waterfront still on it, Damien. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was whole. He was upright. There was something on his left sleeve that might have been river water, or might have been something else, and she registered it and filed it and addressed it later. His face had the expression of a man who has been through the thing and is now on the other side of it and is still in the process of arriving fully. The adrenaline metabolizing, the operational focus beginning to release, the person underneath the function beginning to reassemble. She said, "You came back." He said, "I said I would." She nodded. She looked at his sleeve. She said, "Sit down." He said, "Elena, you've been on that leg for 4 hours. Sit down." The corner of his mouth moved. He sat. She found the medical kit. She knew where it lived now, the way she knew where everything lived. And she came back and she checked the sleeve, and it was river water and grease, nothing requiring attention, and she checked his hands and his face, and the whole inventory of him with the focused practicality of someone who needs to confirm a thing before they can release the tension that has been holding them upright for 4 hours and 16 minutes. He let her do it. He sat still and let her work through it and watched her face while she did. And when she was satisfied and stepped back, he said quietly, "I'm all right." She said, "I know that now." She sat in the chair across from him. The entrance hall was empty. Adrian had moved the team through, and the house had settled back into its nighttime register, that particular acoustic texture she'd learned to read. The lamp on the side table cast the kind of light that makes a room feel like an interior rather than a space, warm and bounded and specific. She said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. He told her cleanly and completely. Reyes, the warehouse, the name Reyes had given, the way the operation had resolved. He didn't soften the resolution, and she didn't ask him to. She listened the way she always listened to him, with the full attention that he had identified in her as one of the things that cost him his certainty. The attention of someone who receives information rather than filtering it through what they need it to be. When he finished, she said, "Is it over?" He said, "The Carbone operation against you is over. The family will recalibrate. There may be a period of..." She didn't need him to finish that sentence. "There may be a period, but you are not a target anymore." She looked at him. She said, "And the man Reyes named, the one who authorized it?" Damien said, "Being handled through separate channels by the end of the week." She nodded slowly. She looked at her hands. She said, "That's the world you live in." "It is," he said. He said it without defense and without apology. He said it the way he said things that were true and costly and not subject to revision. She looked up. She said, "I know. I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I understood what this was from the beginning." He said, "You understood the outline." She said, "I understand the substance now." She held his eyes. "That's different, but it's not a reason to be somewhere else." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had catalogued over weeks, and which she now understood was not control, was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of it, held with precision, because he had learned that things held imprecisely tend to break. He said, "You should sleep." She said, "So should you." He said, "I need 20 minutes in the study first." She stood. She looked at him, the whole of him, the man in the chair with the cane leaning against the armrest and the cold night still in his jacket and the particular quality of exhausted certainty in his face. She said, 20 minutes. She went to her rooms. She lay down without undressing. She was asleep in 4 minutes. In the morning, he walked to the kitchen without the cane. She was already there, 6:30, coffee, the kitchen window, the garden in the flat November light. She heard him in the hall, and then she heard the difference, the sound of footsteps without the third beat, without the cane's placement, and she turned from the window before he came through the door. He crossed the kitchen threshold under his own power, not smoothly. There was effort in it, the concentrated effort of someone doing something that requires the full attention of the body, not yet automatic, not yet fluid. But he crossed it, and he went to the coffee maker, and he poured, and he stood at the counter. She watched him. She didn't say anything. He didn't look at her. He was concentrating, the way you concentrate when you are doing something that you have been rebuilding from the cellular level, and every repetition is a statement about what you intend your life to be. Then he looked up. He looked at her directly. The way he'd looked at her in the east hallway after the garden, and in the study with the operational maps, and in the entrance hall last night. The full, undivided, ungoverned attention. He said, "The therapy team thinks full mobility is possible. Not certain, but possible. Within 6 to 8 months." She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I've been standing in the East Room for 3 weeks without telling anyone." He paused. "It costs something each time, but it costs less than the time before." She looked at him. She said, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular honesty of a man who has decided that the cost of honesty is lower than the cost of its alternative, "Because I didn't want anyone to watch me fail at it." She thought about that. She thought about a man who ran an organization that controlled 3 states and had survived an assassination attempt and handled a warehouse full of armed men the previous night, and who had been standing alone in a room in the dark for 3 weeks because he was afraid to fail at walking in front of people. She said, "I would have watched." He looked at her. She said, "I wouldn't have said anything. I wouldn't have treated it as evidence of anything other than what it was. And if you'd fallen, I would have helped you up, and then I would have left the room." He held her gaze for a long moment. He said, "I know," she said, "so stop doing it alone." Something moved through his expression. Slow, deliberate, the way large things move when they've been fixed in one position for a very long time. He said, "All right." She turned back to the window. Outside, the November garden was stripped and honest. The trellis bare now, the roses gone finally to the cold after their long hold. The groundskeeper had cleared the last of the fall debris, and what remained was the structural truth of the garden. The bones of it, the paths and frames and planted anchors that would carry the spring when it came. It was not beautiful the way the roses were beautiful. It was something more reliable than that. 3 days later, Victor asked to speak with her. She found him in the east sitting room, not the study, not the kitchen, which told her it was something personal rather than operational. He was standing at the window when she came in, which told her the same thing. Victor Bellini stood at windows the way other men sat at desks. When he needed to say something that required distance from the furniture of authority, he said, "I want to tell you something about before you arrived." She sat. She said, "All right." He said, "When the contract was drawn, I advised against it." She looked at him. He said, "Not against the debt resolution, against the marriage structure. I thought it was—" He paused, selecting. "I thought it created a vulnerability, a personal exposure in a context where personal exposure had already been used as a weapon." He turned from the window. "I was wrong." She said, "You were protecting him." "I was protecting the organization," he said, which I convinced myself was the same thing. He looked at her steadily. "It wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you stayed," he said. "Not because of the contract, because you chose to stay after you understood what staying meant." He paused again. "And because what you've done for him, not the operational contributions, though those were significant, what you've done for him personally is something I've been trying to accomplish through competence and loyalty for 7 years, and was not, in fact, something I was capable of." She looked at the floor. She looked up. She said, "What did I do?" "You made him willing to be seen failing at something," Victor said, "and you made it cost him nothing to be." He was quiet. "You have no idea how long that's been impossible." She sat with that. She thought about the East Room, the 3 weeks of standing in the dark alone, and what it had cost him to say "I know" when she said "I would have watched," and what it meant that he'd said it. She said, "He's still learning." Victor said, "So is everyone in this house." She looked at him. His face was the face of a man who has transferred the thing he's been carrying for a long time and feels, in the specific way of that transfer, both lighter and older. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once. He left the room. She sat in the east sitting room for a while after that, in the good light from the window, and thought about all the structures people build to manage the distance between what they are and what they're afraid of becoming, and how sometimes the only thing that dismantles those structures is a person who refuses to treat the underlying fear as evidence of inadequacy. On a Sunday in the third week of November, he came to find her in the library. She was at the reading table with a book she was actually reading, which had become the norm again. The first week she'd held books as props, and somewhere in the middle weeks she'd begun reading them properly, and now the library was genuinely hers in the way the West Wing and the kitchen window and the far section of the garden had become hers. He came in without knocking, which he'd begun doing sometime in the last month, the gradual erosion of the formal boundary between his house and her space within it. He said, "Come outside." She looked up. "It's November." He said, "I know what month it is." She put the book down. She went outside. The garden in late November was not what it had been. She knew that already. She'd been watching it change from the kitchen window, the daily incremental stripping back to structure. But walking in it was different from watching it, and she hadn't been in the far section since the operation. And when he led her there, slowly, without the cane, with the careful deliberateness of a man who is choosing each step because he can, she saw that the trellis was bare and the ground was cold and the dark roses were entirely gone. She felt it more than she'd expected to. She stood at the spot where she'd stood on operation morning, with the frost on the grass and the earpiece and the 40 seconds, and she looked at the bare trellis and felt the particular sadness of a thing that held through everything, and then ended anyway, the way things do. He was standing beside her. She said, "They're all gone." He said, "Until April." She looked at him. He said, "They come back, same canes, same position, every spring since I had them planted." She said, "When did you plant them?" He said, 4 years ago, the year after the assassination attempt. I was told the recovery timeline was 18 months. He looked at the trellis. I needed something to watch that was going to take longer than 18 months and was going to insist on coming back regardless of what the winter did to it. She stood in the cold garden and looked at the bare trellis and felt the full weight of that. A man planting late-season roses in the year after someone tried to kill him, choosing something that would persist in return, not because it was easy, but because persistence was the thing he needed to believe in. She said, "They insisted pretty hard." He said, "Yes." She said, "So did you." He was quiet. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the trellis with the expression that was not controlled and was not the thing beneath the control, was something further, the territory past both of those, the place he got to rarely and had begun, in the last weeks, to allow her to see. He said, "Elena." He stopped. She waited. He said, "The debt. Your father's debt." He looked at her. "It was satisfied in full the day you signed the contract. By the terms we agreed." She said, "I know." He said, "You are not here because of an obligation. You haven't been for some time." She said, "I know that too." He turned to look at her. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it the way you answer everything, without the version of it that protects either of us." She said, "All right." He said, "Are you here because you choose to be?" She looked at him. The cold November light was the flat, precise light of a season that has stripped everything to its structure, and in it she could see his face with complete clarity, the sharpness and the exhaustion and the patient, terrified waiting of a man who has asked the question that costs the most. She thought about the West Wing and the library shelves she'd filled and the 40 seconds in the garden and the east hallway and the kitchen on 100 mornings and the east room where he'd been standing alone in the dark for 3 weeks and the moment at the warehouse door when Adrian had said, "Then we should go," and Damien had looked at the river and turned back. She said, "Yes." He said, "That's a complete answer." She said, "It is." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and brought out something small. A ring, plain and specific, not elaborate, not a statement of wealth, but a statement of intention, the kind of object chosen by someone who understands that simplicity is not the absence of meaning, but its concentration. He said, "This isn't the contract. This is not an arrangement or an obligation or a structure I'm building to manage a risk." He paused. "This is me asking you, not as anything else, just as the person standing in this garden, to stay." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about everything she'd been before she came here, the studio apartment, the $1,100, the woman who'd signed a contract on the hood of a car at 3 a.m. with shaking hands. And she thought about who she was now, inside these iron gates, in this library, in this garden, in this life that had not been the one she'd planned and was, in every way that mattered, the truest one she'd ever lived. She took the ring. She put it on her own hand, which was steadier than it had been the night she'd signed the contract. Steadier than it had ever been, she thought. She looked at him. She said, "I already stayed." He said, I know. I needed to ask anyway." She said, "Because it had to be a choice." He said, "Yes." She stepped toward him. He did not step back. She put her hand against his face, not the chest the way she had in the East hallway, the palm to sternum certainty of aftermath, but his face, the line of his jaw, the specific reality of him under her hand. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and looked at her the way he looked at things he had decided to stop protecting himself from. He said, "The roses come back in April." She said, "I'll be here in April." He said, "And May." She said, "Yes." He said, "And after that?" She looked at him. She said, "Stop asking questions you already know the answers to." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a small expression on his face. On his face, that fractional movement was everything. The accumulated evidence of a man learning, late and carefully, and at considerable cost, that what he'd spent years fortifying himself against was not, in fact, what he most needed protection from. She took his hand. He took hers. They stood in the November garden in the flat, clear light with the bare trellis and the cold ground and the structural truth of a place that had been stripped to its bones and was, beneath all of it, still good, still sound, still rooted, still capable of carrying whatever came in the spring. Later, Sienna would ask her, "What was the moment you knew?" Elena would think about it honestly, the way she thought about everything now, without the protective editing, without the version that was easier to say. She would say, "When he told me the roses came back. Not that they were beautiful, not that he'd planted them for any reason that was about beauty. That they came back. That was what mattered to him." Sienna would say, "That's it? That's the moment?" Elena would say, "It told me everything about who he was, what he valued, what he'd been doing alone in this house for 4 years before I arrived." She would pause. "It told me that the thing I was falling for wasn't a story I'd constructed. It was the actual person." Sienna would nod slowly and say, "And you weren't afraid of that?" Elena would say, "I was terrified of it." Sienna would say, Elena would say, "But I'd signed a contract that required honesty." And the honest answer was that the terror and the rightness were the same thing. The Viscari estate in late November stood quiet behind its iron gates, its windows lit against the early dark, its grounds stripped to the honest architecture of a place that has weathered what it needed to weather and is waiting, without urgency, for what comes next. The security team ran their rotations. Victor sat with his accounts. Adrian Knox reviewed the week's intelligence the way he reviewed everything, methodically, without drama, building the picture one fact at a time. In the East sitting room, Sienna Brooks was on the phone with someone who made her laugh loudly enough that it carried through the hall, and Elena, passing on her way to the library, heard it and felt it land in her chest with the specific warmth of something ordinary and precious. In the library, on the shelf she'd filled across the weeks of her arriving, the books stood in the order she'd placed them, not by title, not by size, but by the particular logic of her own mind, the way things connected to each other in her reading, the private architecture of an attention that had always been looking for something to trust. In the garden, the trellis waited. In April, the roses would come back dark and certain, the same canes, the same insistent color, the same refusal to be anything less than completely themselves. They would come back the way things come back when they are planted by someone who understands that returning is not the same as never having left, that the value is in the survival of the winter, the willingness to go bare and cold and structural, and to open again anyway. Damien Viscari stood at the library window in the early evening dark and watched the garden and felt the weight of his own standing. The leg, the ground, the 4 seconds in the waterfront night when he'd lifted the cane and the earth had held him. He thought about what it meant to be held by something, not protected from falling, but held in the act of standing, the world solid beneath you, someone's presence beside you that did not require your performance or your invulnerability or any version of yourself other than the true one. Elena came in behind him. He heard her footsteps. He had memorized the sound of her footsteps the way he had memorized the positions of every object in this house, with the same precision and for a different reason. A reason that had nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with the particular quality of attention that chooses, finally, to learn a person rather than merely manage them. She stood beside him. She looked at the garden. He looked at the garden. After a while, she said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "April." She leaned her shoulder against his. He did not move away. Outside, the early dark came down over the estate, and the iron gates, and the bare trellis, and the cold, good ground. And inside the library, two people stood at the window and looked at the garden they would both be in when the roses came back. And the silence between them was not the silence of the first night in the study, not the silence of two strangers in a contract, but the silence of people who have said the true things and have nothing left to prove and are simply, at last, here. The story did not end with a war won or a betrayal resolved or a contract fulfilled. It ended with a shoulder against a shoulder in the early dark, and a window, and a garden waiting for spring, and two people who had both been afraid of the same thing, not the violence or the loss or the cost, but this, the radical ordinary fact of being known and staying anyway. It was enough. It was in the end the only thing that had ever been enough.